Benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 1 of the Secunda Secundae, the second half of the second book of the Summa. The topic for this lecture is faith, and I am Dr. Thibault. So if you've been following so far, now if you watch this a year ahead of now, it won't make a difference, but if you've been watching so far, I started with the cardinal virtues. So that's where we started, because the theological virtues are more difficult. They're more essential, they're more critical, but they're also more difficult because they are dealing with more abstract ideas, right? If you're thinking about vainglory or about lying, these are very basic issues in some ways. Faith might sound simple, but it's really much more complicated than things like vainglory or gluttony. So we'll start here with the catechism. We have 16 questions to cover, and many of these questions have very long list of articles to cover. This one that we have is 10 articles, something like that. So it's quite long. So the Catechism says, faith is man's response to God, who reveals himself and gives himself to man, at the same time brings man to superabundant light as he searches for the ultimate meaning of his life. It sounds very much like something St. Ambrose would write, and this is from Article 26 for the Catechism. It's man's response to God, and it's about him entering into this superabundant light. I think this is a good definition because it summarizes a lot of the themes within the section on faith. Okay, so the first article, again, we have a bit to go over. So the first truth is, what is the object of faith that we are looking at? The object of faith. Now, Pseudo-Dionysius says that faith is about the simple and everlasting truth. St. Thomas expounds upon that a bit in his response and looks at it both through the lens of the material object and the formal object. Now, the material object, this goes back to the four causes. If you look at the material object, what is the actual object? If you think about the thing as a very tangible thing, right? What is the object of faith? What is the object of fruit would be the apple, right? It's what is it materially? It's God. God is the first truth. God is the object of faith. So God God in and of himself is the object of faith. Now there's also a formal object of faith, and that is still the first truth, but through the means of divine truth. And it's the way in which God and the divine principles are known. So we can't really know God in and of himself in the material way. I know it's a bit of a contradictory terms because God is immaterial, but as an object, right? As the object or the subject, right? That we are pursuing. The way in which we know that object person is through the formal object. Who is he in terms of what can we know? So St. Thomas gives an example. Through faith, the first truth is to God as medical arts is to health, in terms of the formal object. So the formal object of the medical arts is health. The formal object of the first truth through faith is God. Really, there's no sense of all parts of that first truth point towards God, just like all parts of the medical arts point towards health. You can You can consider how you do it, why you do it, when you do it, the appropriate way of doing it. Right? There's a lot of different questions, but in terms of the medical science, it all aims at that final end, which is health. Now for faith, that final end, the who, what, where, how, what's the best way, it all aims at God. Now we consider the second article, the object of faith, is it simple or complex? And is it by intellect or proposition? So St. Thomas says faith is considered in two ways. In itself, the object itself, I should say, is God, who is simple. So God in and of himself is simple, right? It's perfectly unified, doesn't have parts, is purely himself, yesterday, today, and forever, unchanging. God is simple. In terms of the believer, the part of the believer, it's complex by way of proposition. So we only know God through these different manifestations, right? Through Scripture, through the life of Jesus, through revelation, through nature indirectly, right? We know God in many different shades and parts, but it would be like trying to figure out the shape of a prism by looking at the rainbows that come out of the prism, right? In theory, you could put all of those rainbows back together again and come up with the shape of that prism, but that would be complex, right? That's not a simple thing, right? It all points in a direction, but there are many facets to it. It's not purely an intellectual pursuit either, right? We can't rationalize God. If God could fit within human intellect, God would not be God. And that's some of the debate in the present day. If you look at a lot of the atheists today, they want proof that God exists and the nature of God and of final things, all within the realm of the human intellect. And if it could fit into the human intellect, it would be lesser than the human intellect, which would then not be God, because the human intellect would be greater than God. So it's all by way of proposition rather than by intellect. Can faith be false? That's the next question. And the answer is faith cannot be false insofar as it is faith. Now, can people believe wrong things? Of course they can. We can't have hundreds of religions and there not be any false statements, right? So that would be an impossible thing logically. St. Thomas says, though, the formal object of faith is the first truth, God, right? We know that. There is no belief of faith which has not been demonstrated by the first truth. So all beliefs of faith come from God. So we believe beliefs of faith, and all of them come from God. Therefore, they can't be false, right? Anything that comes from God is not false, right? That's quite an obvious statement, right? But there are many things people believe which are false opinions about God, right? There are many false ideas about God through human conjecture. And it's not impossible for false opinions to be the outcome of faith, right? So there can be many false opinions. Even when you turn to the scriptures, if you recall the story of the father who says, God, I'll do anything to be faithful to you. The next being that walks out of my house, I'll sacrifice. He's thinking it'll be a cat or a cow or whatever, and it's his daughter, right? And he sacrifices his daughter to God, and you think, how can, God allow this? How can it be so brutal? Well, God never told him to say that. God never told him to do that, right? So did God, you could say, well, God demanded the daughter of that man. God never said anything to that man about that, right? He came up with this conjecture of his own, right? He came up with this vow on his own, and it was a bad vow, right? It was a bad vow. It didn't have anything to do with God. In a situation similar would be the sacrifice of Isaac. In this, there's restraint, right? When it comes from God, there was restraint. When it comes from person's conjecture, it could be whatever people want, right? People can say whatever they want about God in conjecture, but that's not true faith, because all true faith comes from God. Now, can objects of faith be seen is the fourth article, and the answer is no, they cannot be seen. Objects of faith cannot be seen. So the intellect ascends to things in two ways. Through being moved to assent by its very object, and in this way, in terms of first principles, through the intellect, right? So you can know 2 + 2 = 4, right? Through the intellect, because it's logically required, right? It exists logically. You can go through logical deductions for certain things and know that it's true logically, right? In and of itself, right? By the intellect alone, based on the first principles of math, the first principles of whatever it is, right? By the intellect alone. The next is through something else, and this is through conclusions based on science, right? So through experiencing the material world around us, through touching it, through smelling it, to observing it, right? Through some sense of relationship with it, there can then be assent to that very object, right? Because one has personal experience with it, right? So that would be the sciences and the intellect. Now we can also know something in a voluntary sense, and by choosing it, not because one has rationalized it or because one has observed it, but because one believes it. So if there's something somebody has voluntarily chosen, and there is fear or doubt, then it is opinion. And if it is without fear or doubt, then it is faith. So faith is something which is voluntarily chosen without fear or doubt. If that happens, then you have faith. But again, if it's something you can see and test, that's called science. That's not called faith. And if it's something you just purely rationalize, then it is intellect, but it's not faith. Faith is not about science. So that's the fifth article. All science is derived from things that are self-evident and are seen principles, right? There are things that can be seen and tested. If it's not possible for something which is science, for one may believe, right? So there's some things that you know because you have tested it, science, right? But then there's quite a bit that is not believed because they have tested it, but because somebody has told them. And this isn't just a matter of faith. This is something, this exists within the sciences as well. So, a young biologist goes to college and their professor is up there teaching them about amoebas and single-celled organisms and about DNA and electron microscopes. And the student believes them, right? It's not that they have necessarily seen it. Sometimes you can't through the microscope. But even then, you have to believe your teacher to know what you're seeing. Otherwise, you don't really know. You see something, but you only can make sense of it because your teacher has told you about it. And that teacher probably knows about it because they were taught at one point. And this has come down the line because you've read it in a science book, because you've watched videos on it, because you've been taught it by other scientists, right? There's most things we believe actually have very little to do with pure science. Most of it has to do with being told, right? This is in some ways opinio, right? Opinion or belief. Right? Most of what we believe, we've gotten it from someone. So if you are an unbeliever, according to St. Thomas, you are in ignorance of things that are of faith, for neither do they see nor do they know in themselves, nor do they know them to be credible. So in many ways, many people are acting in faith, right? So that young biology student is acting in faith because they don't know about electron microscopes by intellectus. It's not a rational argument. They haven't seen one in person, therefore there's no science. And they might not have fear or doubt that one exists because they believe their teacher and it's in the books. Maybe they've seen a photograph of one, right? You have no reason to believe electron microscopes don't exist. Therefore, that young scientist is acting in faith, right? Because of the credibility of the sources, right? You have credibility of the sources. In this way, science and all aspects of science, including the theological sciences, often are relying on the credibility of people who know more than us, right? In terms of the theological sciences, the ultimate credibility would be that God has manifested it to people, right? Perhaps this isn't important to many people, but things like the idea that angels have spoken to Thomas Aquinas, that means something, right? Thomas Aquinas is not an overly emotional, hysteric person, right? A very logical and intelligent person wrote the Summa, not somebody who's dealing with mental illness or addictions or emotional problems, right? Somebody like that couldn't have written the Summa. And he also claims to have seen angels and has spoken to God. Well, there's some credibility to that. And then to St. Francis, right? Again, maybe not as logical as St. Thomas, but quite credible, I think. And angels appear to him, right? And if there were two examples, well, who knows? But when there are hundreds of examples, thousands of examples of very credible people who've had these experiences with the divine, all the way back to the apostles, you can somewhat look at the sources, right? When I was in a science class, I didn't really question my science teacher who had a PhD in microbiology. I didn't really doubt his insights into microbiology. Likewise, I don't really question the insights of someone like St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Francis or Bonaventure or Ambrose or Augustine, Pseudo-Dionysius, right? They seem to know what they're talking about, right? They seem to be speaking both intellectually and as people who have read the material and have had personal experiences with God. That would make me think that's credible. That's credible. So I have faith. Well, it's not in a vacuum, though, right? If Jesus came and then there was just silence, right? Silence, right? Just absolutely nothing since. There might be a sign that might not have been much of anything, but the credibility and the experiences of the saints have, there's something more. And it's not just on a human level, it's God working through them. St. Thomas points out that God isn't using these saints, right? He's not using people like Thomas Aquinas. He's not using people like St. Augustine and the fathers of the church just to get them to heaven. That's not the point. God has given them these graces for the sake of the entire Christian community, right? For the sake of all people. He inspired the Summa, the city of God, right? God inspired this for the good of the people. So can faith be divided into certain articles? Now the next three questions kind of deal with these issues here. So faith is divided into certain articles. This isn't that controversial. It's articulus is the term, which means small parts. And they come together, right? The small parts of the body. If you think of all the bones in the hand, for example, you got a dozen bones in the hand and all the ligaments and muscles and things that make the hand work. They all are small little parts, but they work together for the sake of a hand. Well, likewise, all the articles of faith work together to create something functional, right? Something good, something whole. So it's very similar. So some of these categories, some of these articles of the faith include the passion, resurrection, the sacraments, Christ's humanity, the human condition. Right? These are articles of the faith. Is it proper to have articles? Well, they just help us organize it and to remember it and to articulate it better, right? So I don't think that's that controversial that we put them into categories. Do the articles of faith change or evolve over time? This is an interesting question. So the articles of faith stand in relation to the doctrine of the faith. So, has anything changed since the death and resurrection of Jesus in terms of the Christian faith? Not really. No fundamental truths have changed. Well, but has anything changed? Yes, something has changed. At the time of Christ, even in the gospel, it was repeatedly says they didn't know what he was talking about, right? When he says, come follow me, and they say, we will follow you. And Jesus says, you will, but not yet. But you will, right? Which is true because they all but St. John were martyred, but all but St. John ran away at the crucifixion. So, people at the time didn't fully understand all of the elements of it. And if you go back to the Gospels themselves, if you think of the earliest writings on the Gospels, they started with the resurrection. They started with suffering, death, and resurrection. The Paschal mystery is where they started. And then they kind of went back and filled in the gaps with the most important things that they thought somebody needed to know in order to believe. If you were a follower of Jesus and you just saw this and you wanted to tell somebody, you wouldn't start with, well, in the beginning, with God and Adam and Eve, and then there was Moses, and then there was Noah. You'd lose people. You start with, he rose from the dead, right? You start with that, right? You start with the bang, and then you start filling in the gaps, right? So as time goes on, people start asking questions of like, well, he seems to be saying, me, the Father and I are one, and I am the bread of life. Some of these things start to unfold. They start to think about it, and it's like, he's really kept saying that he was God, right? I think we might have missed something when he was saying it, but it kind of unfolds. As an example, the Trinity, the theology of the Trinity unfolds. It was always there. It's just it took a while to unfold it, right? We're still unfolding doctrines, right? It's a lot of the Marian doctrines. They weren't in the first century, but they evolved in the early church and throughout. So in some ways, knowledge exists in two ways in terms of the articles. One in the form of the teacher. Now in the natural sciences, as a teacher teaches, they also learn. So a microbiologist who teaches for 30 years is teaching, but they probably also learned something in 30 years about microbiology. In terms of the faith, our teacher is the Holy Spirit. So in that regard, the teacher has not changed over time. The teacher knows exactly what the teacher has always known. So what has changed? The learner. If God would have given us the fullness of the faith in the very first day, it would have went right over everyone's head, right? It takes time. You have to feed people little by little. They're like children, as they say. You give them more and more and more and more as they can handle. The more you give them, the greater capacity they have for more. But it takes time. It comes slowly, both for the individual and for the church, right? You could say, well, the church in the first century doesn't look like the church in the 21st century. That's true, right? But we weren't ready for that church in the first century, right? This has unfolded. Hopefully today we could say we are closer to the mystery of Christ than they were in the second century. Now that's kind of a strange thing to say, that we are closer to the mystery of Christ in the 21st century than they were in the second century. But it's true, because we've had a lot more time to unfold this, to think about it, to contemplate it, to have lives of the saints. We have a lot more experience with it than they had in the second century. We might know more about Christ today than even I would hate to say even the apostles, because they knew him in a much different way, but the people right after the apostles who never had met him, right? Because we actually have a greater insight into it than even the apostles might have had at the time. They didn't. Again, God didn't pick theologians; He picked fishermen, and they spread the good news, but they didn't fully understand what was happening at the time. Now, is there a formulation of the articles of faith? I'm not going to go into any detail of this, other than St. Thomas points out that there is, a formulation. You start with the Godhead, the unity of God, the three persons of God, the works of God. Then you can get into the incarnation, the virgin birth, the passion, death. Right? You move through. You move through them, and you start with the biggest first, and you kind of work through the articles of the faith. The particular order isn't necessarily that important. Now, this one I thought was very interesting, but it's the most interesting when you get to the response to objection 6, I think. And it's, is faith embodied in a symbol? And you think, well, what is the symbol of faith? If you think off the top of your head, it's probably something like the cross, maybe a chalice. I don't know. What would be a symbol of faith? Well, there's a lot of symbols of faith. Well, when St. Thomas is talking about this, he's talking about the creed. The creed is a symbol of faith, right? It's a series of maxims, right? It's the series of truths of the faith, which are collected in order to teach it to others, right? If you want to know what you believe, look to the creed, right? It makes it easier. Now, we have more than one symbol of faith because we have more than one creed. Now, St. Thomas, this is where, in response to Article 6, I think it's the most interesting. We have the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. Well, why would we use one over the other? St. Thomas says, the symbol of the Apostles' Creed, was drawn up at a time of persecution before the faith was made public. It said secretly at Prime and Compline, as though it were against the darkness of the past and future eras. I think that's very beautiful. He's reflecting back to the monks, right? The life of the monks and the religious who, at Compline and at Prime, in the middle of the night, and that when it's dark, they repeat the Apostles' Creed, because when the apostles compiled this creed, it was at a time of persecution of the church and in darkness. And in darkness, you recite the creed of that persecuted church. I think that's beautiful. That's really beautiful. Now, how about the Nicene Creed, the one that we do more publicly, right? It's sometimes called the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, right? The one from Constantinople. 787 or so AD. It says it came from the explanation of the symbols of the apostles. It's longer and it fills in some of the gaps, that aren't in the Apostles' Creed. And it was drawn up after the faith had already spread abroad. Now it's more universal. And it was when the church was already at peace, right? No longer persecuted. And it's sung publicly at Mass, right? So now it's more about the beauty of it, and it's more of a didactic tool. It's more teaching. It can be more beautiful. It can flow better because we have time to reflect on it in the time of peace. Whereas the Apostles' Creed is more a creed of the persecuted church, which I think is a great distinction because we have these two creeds, and why we pick one over another for whatever prayer had never really been made that clear to me. But this is a great explanation, I think. If you were praying for vocations or something like that, praying the Apostles' Creed might be a good part of that prayer service, right? Versus the Mass where it's the heavenly Jerusalem where you would do the Nicene Creed. Interesting. Lastly, can the Pope draw up the symbol, right? Can the Pope write a creed, right? Write the creed. And the answer is yes, yeah. That you speak the same thing and that there is no schism among you, and this could not be secure unless any question of faith that may arise be decided by him who presides over the whole church, so that the whole church may hold firmly to his decision. So the Pope has this authority over the church on matters of faith. And this isn't, again, the creed is not determining what the faith is. It's a symbol of the faith, right? I thought of this a little bit earlier, and I should have written it down if I wanted to come up with a really great example. We could have said, a creed that could have said, Jesus, he was the son of a carpenter. He liked to go fishing with his friends. He was really close to his mom. He used to go around and go to weddings. He died one day. Right? That's all true. Right? That could have been the creed. That could be the creed because it's not true. It's not untrue. It's perfectly true. Right? Jesus was a carpenter and he went fishing with his friends. And he was close to his mom. Right? That's true. It's not the most important thing. Right? The Pope can draw up a creed because he can take what's true and he can say, we want to focus on these areas, right? If you think of the Filioque, for example, that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, right? This and the Son was added. This is the last piece of the creed to be added, that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son. Well, why was this brought in? Because of Arianism spreading through Spain, and the local church of Spain added that in to really focus on the divinity of Christ, because this was a heresy popping up around the last millennium, where people were doubting the divinity of Christ. So they've refocused the creed on the divinity of Christ more specifically. And then the Pope said this should be universally taught, right? Arianism is a perpetual issue. It's an issue even today. Therefore, let's put this in the creed to really reaffirm this element of truth. Is it not, do the Orthodox think that it's not true? They don't have it in their creed. Do the Orthodox think it's not true? Not necessarily. They're just upset that we put it in the creed. But you could put many things in the creed. You could put in the Immaculate Conception in the creed if you want, right? It's just depending on what should we focus on as a society that needs to really teach the faith, right? We can't read the whole gospel. We can't read the whole Bible at Mass. what do we really need to know as the essence of the faith in order to know the faith and to spread the faith? Well, the Pope and the Church and the councils have said the creed, right? And this is what's in it. Could it change? Absolutely. Because it's not that it's not that anything within Christianity has changed. It's what do we need to focus on to do this, right? I don't think they're going to change the creed, but if you had the American church changing the creed, they would probably put something in there that points to a pro-life issue because of the issue with abortion and euthanasia and all of that, right? There could be an element of that kind of squeezed in there, right? We don't put moral issues in there, but you could put something from in the life of Christ or Scripture that really kind of reaffirms the pro-life message that God has known people, when they were in their mother's womb. God created us in our mother's womb, or something like that. Like, that's a theological truth that could be put in the creed to address a certain issue within a culture, right? So that could be put in there. Again, people don't like when the church changes, so I don't think it'll happen. And you shouldn't change it too quickly. We haven't changed it in 1,000 years, so I don't think they're going to change it. But the Pope could, right? With the bishops, with the councils, they can use this to promote the faith. That's the point of the creed, is to promote the faith. So in conclusion, the object of faith is the first truth, which is God. The object of faith is simple in God and himself, but complex to us because we only get these pieces and we couldn't possibly understand it even if we had all of the pieces. Nothing false can come under faith. If something is false, then it was our own conjectures. It wasn't actually manifested by God to us. The object of faith is not seen. Seen things deal with more with the sciences, but most of us, even scientists, are not working with science. Most of us are working within the field of faith. We believe credible sources, right? This is, it's not just opinion on one side, and it's not just, I've seen it with my own eyes on the other. There's an awful lot in between where we are confident in what we know. And it's a little bit of both, right? It's a little bit of the, I didn't see it, but I know somebody who did see it who's credible, right? That's a certain amount of faith. The article of faiths can be divided because they are kind of teaching tools. They're useful tools. The numbers of the articles don't really matter. You can put in whatever order you want, but having articles of faith is useful. The articles of faith are embodied within the creed, which is a very important thing, and there can be different creeds for different purposes depending on what you're trying to teach. And the Pope can oversee the establishment of creeds and the publication of creeds because he has the role as a universal pastor of the church, but he doesn't do it on his own. He does it in conjunction with the councils and the rest of the church. Okay, so next we will continue on with the 16 questions of faith. We're moving into question number 2.